Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me and don't know Karama, I am Aisha Rahman. I'm the Executive Director for Karama Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. We're so happy that you all joined us today, and we're very grateful to Asian Americans Advancing Justice for co-sponsoring the event and for hosting us this afternoon. While Karama has come to LA in the past, this is the first time I'm here doing an event for Karama, so if you'll allow me, I'll spend a little bit of time telling you about our work. Karama was started over 20 years ago by 3 Muslim women lawyers that were disgruntled about how Islam was being portrayed in the US. Our founders believed that if the world truly knew about Islam and its beliefs and its tenets, the world would be a better place. And so they set out to educate themselves and the world about Islam. So what were they concerned about? They were concerned about patriarchy because they knew in Islam, women and men were created from the same nafs, from the same soul. They were concerned about racism because they knew that God created us from different nations and tribes so that we could know one another. They were concerned about dishonesty, corruption, and apathy because they knew that Islam was built on a foundation of adala, or justice, and that we as Muslims are charged with persistently standing firm for justice. With these spiritual tools, our founders and our organization set forth to educate and to tackle issues in our communities through the only avenue that we knew: the law. For those of us, I would dare say all of us, in the civil rights space, it's been a difficult couple of weeks. And frankly, it's been difficult for a lot longer than that. Today, we commemorate Pearl Harbor Day with our fellow Angelenos and remember that not too long ago in this country, Japanese Americans, amongst others, were detained because of their national origin. Before then, and unfortunately still, we know that others in our history have suffered from detention, from profiling, from surveillance, from slavery, and other forms of egregious civil rights and human rights violations. We know that this country was built on the backs of women and men who were forced here, who were disempowered, and were abused. These instances are not few, and they do not exist in a vacuum. As we fight to restore justice to our broken systems in this country, we have to recognize that these stories are interrelated. As broadly different as they are, the human rights violations of the detainees being held at Guantanamo, for example, are related to other civil rights violations taking place in the US, because they arise from the same worldview that divides us into the I and the other. That situation is inherently different and yet related still to the case of a domestic violence survivor who is attempting to protect herself through the law but is aware of the othering attitude, and because of it, she may be too scared to resort to the support of law enforcement for fear that they would destroy her family. We will explore this and other issues on the panel today. Karama has spent the last year working on our Muslim American Stories project. During this project, we hoped to open dialogue about pressing civil rights issues in our country, raising up the voices of the people. We have hosted a series of town hall meetings throughout the United States, talking to the community and looking mostly at the issues impacting the core of the community, which is the family. We have discussed anti-Muslim bullying in schools. We've looked at surveillance and profiling, and now today we're here to talk about bias and profiling within the immigration system, what is happening with immigration reform, and how recent developments are going to impact our communities. Our speakers will also be looking forward. There is much work left to be done, and we hope to learn from you and your stories. What are your questions? What are your concerns? And how can we work together to restore justice? On a final note, I'd like to note that Karama is an apolitical organization. We believe in education, freedom of speech, and a free flow of ideas. So we have invited guests here, maybe with differing viewpoints and insight, so that we can learn from them. This event is being taped, and once the speakers have concluded, we will open up the conversation to you, both present here and those on Twitter and Facebook. The hashtag that we'll be using for the conversation is State of Immigrant Rights at Karama DC. We encourage you to take part in the conversation. With that, I will introduce our first speaker. Jenny Pasquarella is a staff attorney at the ACLU Southern California. She joined ACLU SoCal in 2008. Jenny specializes in immigrant rights and national security litigation and policy advocacy. Her work currently focuses on the civil rights implications of local law enforcement engaging in federal immigration work and the federal government's illegal blacklisting of Muslim immigrants to prevent them from naturalizing or receiving other immigration benefits. Jenny is currently litigating several pertinent cases to our discussion today. Prior to joining ACLU SoCal, Jenny was a legal fellow staff attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights and the ACLU Women's Project, both in New York. She is a graduate of Barnard College and the Georgetown University Law Center, where she earned her JD with a certificate in refugee and humanitarian emergencies and was a public interest scholar. Jenny?
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out on this Sunday afternoon. So I guess with that introduction to the work that Karama is doing and the point of this panel, I wanted to just focus in on one area that I've been working on pretty intensely. And I just say to start that my work focuses on immigrant rights writ large, but really kind of falls into two categories. One is immigration enforcement, so all the various different problems that we have seen with the way in which the government has been enforcing our immigration laws. And the other area is really focused on discrimination in the immigration system and in the process of applying for immigration benefits, which includes naturalization, green cards, visas, asylum, refugee resettlement, the way in which that process is discriminating against particularly Muslim immigrants or immigrants from Muslim-majority countries. And so that's the category of things I wanted to talk about. And I think it's important to, when we all think of immigration reform and the immigration debate that's happening, I think you immediately think of the undocumented population and the broken immigration system and the way the difficulties that people who've dedicated their lives to the United States are having in actually adjusting their status and becoming legally recognized citizens in this country. But the side of immigration reform that we hear of much less, and I think is really important, particularly for the Muslim community to be very aware of and engaged on, is the way in which all of the federal programs and policies that are looking at national security, protecting our country, the ways in which our government is surveilling communities, the ways in which we are stopping and questioning people at the border or at airports, the way in which all of these policies that are aimed at ferreting out terrorist threats are impacting immigrants, and not just because these are things that are impacting them and when they travel and things like this, but are having a very direct impact on people's ability to access important immigration benefits, and have, I think, completely undermined the foundation of our immigration system, which is premised on non-discrimination. When the Immigration and Nationality Act was signed into law, one of the signature pieces of that law was that it was eradicating what had been really endemic national origin and race and ethnicity discrimination in our pre-existing immigration system. What I think is happening now is that through various national security programs, we have basically written into the immigration system, again, the kind of national origin and religious and racial profiling that we long ago banished from our immigration system. So let me describe a little bit about what it is I'm talking about. And I'm sure Hamid will also be talking about some of the ways in which these surveillance programs are impacting the community. But as folks probably are aware, there are a number of different efforts that the federal government has pursued, federal government as well as local government, to deal with the threat of terrorism, right? A lot of these efforts have serious implications for civil rights and are part of a lot of the work that the ACLU has been doing in the way in which they have been completely overbroad and cast a really wide net, identifying people as potential threats just because of their religiosity or their country of origin. So to give you an example, we for many years have done work on overbroad FBI surveillance. So we have a lawsuit currently pending where based on the fact that there was an informant, a man who basically was working with the FBI as an informant to spy in Moss. Well, his explicit instructions as the informant for the FBI on this particular counterterrorism program was to go into more than a dozen mosques in Southern California and to record as many names as possible. Just anybody who was attending the mosque. They wanted him to collect membership information, so to take pictures of any kind of roster or register of members at the mosque. He was instructed to take down license plates in the parking lot during early morning prayer, which was to the FBI a signal of how religious you were, and this just in and of itself was suspicious activity. He was instructed to do all of these types of things, and all of that information was then sent to the FBI and put into the FBI's files. So hold that in your minds for 1 second, and I'll return to why that's significant. So we have really overbroad FBI surveillance happening in Southern California, but across the country, that's really focusing on religion rather than any suspicious activity or evidence of actual criminal activity. And then we have on the other side what's called the terrorist watch list, which is the system that the government has put in place to monitor travelers and to identify people that they think could possibly become terrorist threats. And so if you're put on the terrorist watch list, it means that every time you travel overseas or even domestically, you could be flagged and set aside for questioning, or in the worst cases, not permitted to board an airplane. So if you're put on the no-fly list, for example. This watch list is extremely overbroad. It has thousands and thousands of names on it. The government has now, I think, revealed, although it was, I think, through a source that wasn't an intentional release of information, that there isn't actually any reasonable suspicion that's needed, particularly if it's a non-citizen that they're putting on the list. So people can be put on for any reason, even if it wouldn't, in the criminal system, meet the requirement for a reasonable suspicion of any criminal activity. And so what we've seen is that thousands and thousands of people, particularly people from the Muslim community, are put on this watch list, and they can't get off. There's no mechanism to get your name off of it. You can file a complaint with the government, but usually it's not a meaningful redress system. It doesn't actually allow you to get your name off the list. And so these are two examples of what I would say are overbroad ways in which the federal government is surveilling the community. Now, this overbreadth is important because it is now, these are systems that are now connected to the immigration system, and not just the immigration system, to other federal agencies. So including, like, if you apply for a bank account, the fact, if you're on a terrorist watch list, the bank that's looking at your application is going to know if you're on the watch list or not. So all of these systems are now cross-referenced. And from the government's point of view, this is part of their effort to consolidate information to ensure that that the agencies are communicating, as this was a big problem coming out of 9/11 and something that the government has been working to address, right? And that in and of itself is not a bad thing. What's happening, though, on the immigration side is that there are policies that exist, and we found this out through years of advocacy and representing individuals and lawsuits to uncover the fact that the government for many years now has had a secret program, and when I say the government, it's the immigration agency, USCIS, the Citizenship and Immigration Service, that specifically says that any person who is on the terrorist watch list or who has a record in the FBI's file is automatically deemed a national security concern, and their application has to be treated differently. So essentially, here you are, an individual who's done no harm, who is law-abiding, attends mosque, for example, never done anything, never been arrested, no criminal record, there's no evidence of any threat to the community, yet you've been put on this terrorist watch list, for example, or you happen to attend a mosque that an informant is informing on and provided your name to the FBI. And suddenly now, not only that, you are subjected to this secret policy that the government, the Immigration Service has, that says that if you're considered a national security concern, your application cannot be approved. And so all of a sudden, you're not only on these lists, but you can't be granted citizenship, you can't be granted a green card, you can't be granted a visa, and even your family members can't be granted visas. So what we've seen in our work is that thousands and thousands and thousands of people across the country, but also overseas, are subjected to this policy without ever being told that they've been subjected to it, that the government thinks that they're a national security concern, and that because they think that you're a national security concern, you're never going to have your application approved. And instead, you're going to be put in this kind of black hole where your application will be delayed for years, and only if you're aggressive enough or if you have the financial resources to fight it will you ever have a chance to actually push for a decision, and hopefully to actually litigate it and take it to court if you need to. And so this kind of interconnectedness of this overbroad watch lists and surveillance mechanisms are now having this really severe impact on immigrants who are seeking benefits that they're legally entitled to. And so at the ACLU, we've been working to not just uncover the fact that this policy exists, but to really highlight how it works and the damage that it's having on so many families and communities who are eligible for these benefits and suddenly secretly excluded from them, even though the law says that they're eligible. And just this past July, we filed a lawsuit here in federal court to end this program and to really show that this program is illegal and violates the immigration law as well as the Constitution. I think it's important for civil rights advocates to understand not just the way that these things like the terrorist watch list or the way that the FBI is conducting its massive sort of surveillance work is impacting on the immigration side, but also to understand how it impacts all of the various services that communities seek, because agencies are now sharing all of this information, and the fact that you, for example, with the terrorist watch list, don't have a way to ever clear your name is having an impact not just on you when you travel, but again, your ability to access important immigration benefits, or it could spill over into being able to do things as basic as getting a bank account. So that's kind of what I wanted to present on. I don't know if is that's fine. Great. Okay. Thank you. And I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you, Jenny. I'd like to next introduce Mira Mahmood. Mira is a staff attorney for Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. This is Immigration and Citizenship Project. She provides legal assistance and consultation to immigrants wishing to undergo the process of naturalization, particularly those with complex criminal or immigration histories. Mahmood provides legal assistance at citizenship workshops held by Advancing Justice LA, as well as by partner organizations serving a broad range of communities. In addition, she represents asylum seekers in federal immigration court. Prior to joining Advancing Justice LA, Mahmoud was a volunteer attorney at Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles in their immigration unit and Torture Survivors Project. She was also an intern at the Los Angeles Community Action Network. She was honored for her work at those organizations by the State Bar of California, which presented its President's Pro Bono Service Award to her in October 2013. She received her Master's of Laws degrees from the UCLA School of Law in 2011, specializing in both human rights and social justice law and tax law. She received her Bachelor of Laws from King's College London, England. Mira?
Thank you, everyone. People often call the United States a nation of immigrants, but while that phrase suggests a harmonious coming together of cultures, when one examines our history, it's easy to see a legacy of hatred and oppression. After a mass genocide which annihilated over 90% of the natives of the Americas, these lands have come to be repopulated by those from other places. The first to come were the colonizers and settlers, who soon brought with them African slaves. Once they gained independence from the British, white settlers who'd been here for a few generations stopped viewing themselves as an immigrant community. And thereafter, every new immigrant population which came to the United States has faced prejudice. However, state-sanctioned prejudice has been more visible against immigrants from non-European backgrounds. For example, in the early 1900s, while the Irish and the Italian were discriminated against by British Americans, processing for Europeans to enter the United States from Ellis Island was usually a quick process, a matter of hours up to one day, and they didn't have to prove any family ties to the United States. By contrast, entry into Angel Island on the West Coast was intended to keep out Asian immigrants. So over 30% of people were denied entry. People were held for days, weeks, or even years, and they had to prove family ties to the United States by producing official documentation. The reason why I wanted to begin with a short reminder of history is because when we talk about the experiences of Muslim immigrants, it's important to remember the historical context of the way immigrants in this country have been treated. Today is National Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, but for me, it's difficult to think about Pearl Harbor without also thinking about the internment of Japanese Americans. Their internment was challenged by Fred Korematsu, but our Supreme Court held that military necessity justifies the mass rounding up and incarceration of families, even though the majority of them were U.S. citizens. While Mr. Korematsu's conviction was overthrown by a district court 39 years later, when suppressed intelligence documents showing that the government knew at that time that Japanese Americans were not a threat were revealed. The Supreme Court's decision is still valid. 72 years later, we live in a world where the focus is no longer on Japanese Americans, but the rhetoric that military necessity, or in modern words, national security concerns, justify the suspension of civil rights is still a legal reality. Post 9/11, Muslims live in a society where we have been treated with suspicion and fear, but we're not the first group of immigrants that's been treated in that way. I provide direct legal services, so I would like to speak about the Muslim immigrant experience not as an expert on policy, but as someone who works with community members and who hears their stories. At Advancing Justice, I don't work exclusively with immigrants, but the fact that I work from clients from diverse backgrounds makes me see more clearly that the Muslim immigrant experience could just be called an immigrant experience because many immigrant populations share similar challenges. One way that Muslims do differ from other groups, in my experience, has been that they are more fearful. For example, when I'm assisting people in completing naturalization applications, there's a section in the good moral characters, or in the moral character section, that asks you to list your organizations and affiliations. And in general, we advise all clients that if they want to add any religious affiliations, they can add it in as an indication of good moral character or positive affiliations. But while For example, Christians or Hindus or Buddhists are more comfortable sharing the name of their church or mosque or their church or temple. Most people are more reluctant to name their mosque or to add any kind of identifiers to Muslim organizations that they support. And I think that has to do with them feeling like the U.S. government does not, would review them with more suspicion if they, express their Muslimness. And so that fear really comes down to, the treatment that they have received and also that they perceive other Muslims to be getting from the government and from others. But other issues that, Muslims go through are fairly similar to other immigrant communities. For example, immigrant issues that usually come up frequently are barriers to obtaining services. When I assist people in applying for immigration fee waivers, one of the ways for qualifying for a fee waiver is to be a recipient of public benefits. Permanent residents are not allowed to obtain benefits for the first 5 years of their residency, which is itself a legal barrier, especially when low-income folks need help. But even after the 5-year period is up, I see numerous instances where my clients are wrongly denied benefits, and advocacy is needed to remind caseworkers of that person's eligibility. Barriers to services are exacerbated when people are limited English speaking. Cultural and linguistic differences also impact people's ability or willingness to seek services. Advancing Justice LA assists domestic violence survivors. I've assisted some of our Muslim domestic violence survivors apply for citizenship after our organization has assisted them in obtaining green cards and fighting their battle in family court. I wanted to talk a little bit about domestic violence as an issue impacting Muslim immigrants. Patriarchy and misogyny have been commonplace in cultures around the world, and domestic violence has been normalized in the collective imaginations of many societies. Many abused immigrant women do not come forward because their cultures normalize domestic violence. For example, I'm from Pakistan, and growing up I recognized that many of the men I knew abused their wives, and the majority of parents would hit their children. And when I speak to immigrants from other places, I see that normalization where witnessing pervasive abuse has made people think that this is the way relationships are and this is the way marriages are meant to be. But when immigrant women come to the United States, many of them are therefore unaware of the relief and services that they can get and outlets from that abusive relationship. But even when they are able to, or when they are aware of those services, accessing those services can have their own sets of consequences. For example, if someone is married to a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen and doesn't have legal status, she may be able to file a VAWA self-petition, which is VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, to obtain legal status. Women who do not have a relationship with someone who has legal status may still be able to apply for a U visa as a victim of crime. However, there are caps on U visas, and only 10,000 victims of crimes may be eligible to receive a U visa every year. And that includes victims of all crimes, not just domestic violence. In addition, obtaining the visas require cooperation with law enforcement. Many immigrant women come from countries where the police is corrupt and may be fearful to call the police here. In addition, the experience of immigrants here in relation to the police is not always positive. Many immigrant communities face in addition to domestic violence, they also face police abuse. And then, being Muslim, there's that culture of suspicion and fear that we all live in. So it's even harder to go to seek help from law enforcement agencies. Women who do call the police are frequently victimized and not treated with sensitivity by police officers, and so that further aggravates the dehumanization experience that they're suffering from. It exacerbates their traumas. Abused women frequently do not have jobs, and unless they're able to find free services, find it difficult to pay for lawyers, court fees, and to support themselves and their children once they leave their abusive relationships. Survivors frequently express to me the challenges of trading in their home for a domestic violence shelter and the fears they have about making it on their own in this economy when they have limited education and work experience. Another challenge that many women face is a lack of support from their families and their communities. Even when women do have family members here in the US, a lot of times they're not supportive of them when they decide to leave an abusive relationship. And so even though they may have a family member here, they're not able to go to their house or stay with them. They don't feel like they would be welcome in that space. And so it's a very, it's almost like, it's a very lonely experience because you're fighting everything by yourself and don't have the support of people that you care about. On the flip side, the normalization of domestic violence in some cultures means that some immigrant men are surprised when they realize that their actions may cause them to be deported. Domestic violence is a crime-based ground for deportation, and many men who contact me for help applying for citizenship are surprised that they're not eligible for citizenship and are actually deportable. The deportation of abusers impacts their family. Children are forced to be separated from their fathers, and victims of the abuse can also not enforce any child support payments. It also leads to the exportation of violence back to the countries that those men may have come from. All of these barriers, I think, are rooted in a lack of really awareness and education around those issues. I think that when people really understand their rights as you know, women who are survivors of domestic violence can express to me, it really, is a process of really knowing what your rights are and then trying to take steps to get those rights. But also, I think systematically there's not enough of a discussion about these issues in mosques or other community centers where men can learn about, I may have watched my dad beat my mom all my life, but that's not right. I cannot beat, my children's mom the same way. And so there are a lot of, challenges that just come from a lack of both cultural competency, but in the way that those things are taught to people, because I think that sometimes when people are trying to explain what someone shouldn't do, they don't phrase it in terms that people are familiar with or receptive to. Other things that immigrant families here deal with are the issues caused by the way the immigration system is set up, which includes the visa backlogs. A lot of times families are separated because of everyone in the family not being able to come to the United States at the same time, and then petitioning for your family member may be a process that takes decades and years. My own sister was not able to get her green card at the same time that me and the rest of my family did, which was in '96, and then since then, she got married, so when a petition for her was filed as a married child of a US citizen, there's a 10-year waiting period. So that just causes family disunity. Some people are in one country, others are in another, and then it causes a lot of stress and trauma to the family members. There's also, a number of undocumented folks that live in the US, and it's nice to hear that President Obama is trying to take some steps to help those people. A few years ago, when he announced his Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, it brought relief to young undocumented immigrants who had been in the country and had been attending school and either attending school or had spent some time spent some time in the Army, but with his new executive action, that program is going to be expanded so that the age caps that were placed on the DACA recipients will be removed, so that people that are in their 30s and older can also receive status. He also announced the deferred action for parental accountability, whereby parents of children born in the United States will also be able to apply for status. And while House Republicans and some states are trying to challenge his action, it does seem that he has the authority to pass those reforms. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mira. Our final speaker is Hamid Khan. Hamid is an organizer with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, a broad coalition whose primary goal is to raise public awareness, participation, mobilization, and action on police spying and surveillance, and to sustain long-term movement building that is intersectional to the core on issues, experiences, demographics, and resources. An immigrant from Pakistan, Hamid came to the United States in 1979. As founder and former executive director of the South Asian Network, he helped create the first grassroots community-based organization in Los Angeles, committed to informing and empowering thousands of South Asians in Southern California to act as agents of change in eliminating biases, discrimination, and injustices. Hamid serves on several boards of organizations doing research and working to impact immigrant and refugee policy and empowering youth to challenge injustice. He has received many prestigious awards and recognition for his incredible work. Hamid?
Thank you very much. I want to start off by first honoring the families of Michael Brown, Ezell Ford, Eric Garner, and the hundreds of other black and brown youth who are being murdered on our streets every day, to the extent that even a mainstream newspaper like USA Today came out with a report about 3 months ago that 2 black youth are killed by white cops every week, and over 400 young people are murdered unarmed by law enforcement in this country. And today is also Pearl Harbor Day as well, which reminds me, and then some of the other speakers have lifted that when we speak about the Muslim immigrants, I think it's also, it helps us to understand and acknowledge and recognize that how the other, the face of the other gets constructed, and how all these policies are created and justified and structures are then built to implement these policies. And I'm reminded by the justification for Executive Order 9066 that led to the sending to the concentration camps of thousands of Japanese American. And this is what General DeWitt at the time said, and I quote, that persons of Japanese ancestry contain enemy race blood, hence inherently disloyal and shall always stay unassimilable. So anchored in that, and since we are an organization, AAAJ, that serves the larger Asian American community, it wasn't something new that what we saw immediately after 9/11, that another general, General Ashcroft, came out with a statement stating that persons of certain national origin are a threat to our national security and hence need to be monitored, and that's what led to the development of the NCERS program, the national, the Special Registration Program. But even going back in time as well, in the late 1800s, it was very much somebody who we are very familiar coming from South Asia as Rudyard Kipling, who had started talking about the half-man, half-devil, hoof-tailed individuals, and he was talking about the Chinese, which then led to the Chinese Exclusion Act as well. And the reason I'm kind of raising these things is that I think it's really critical that how these cultural narratives are formed, that how these cultural narratives develop, and then how these cultural narratives lead to a development of policy, lead to development of structures, and at the end of the day then become operationalized, which lead to mass deportations, which lead to mass incarceration, and which lead to basically assaults on basic human rights of everybody. Since Karama deals primarily with domestic violence, I think we also need to look at the intersection between state violence and domestic violence as well. That the state very much creates conditions, many a times, that lead to interpersonal violence as well, whether it's the violence of the state through economic injustices and the economic violence against people, where constantly poverty is perpetuated and people remain in poverty as well, or whether there are laws and conditions that are created that completely identify individuals and which lead to interpersonal violence and family violence as well. So I think when we speak of domestic violence, the issue of state violence needs to be very much lifted and incorporated into our conversations. But I'm not going to take too much time because it's really incumbent that we should all have a conversation together. But what I'd like to do is to see that what do we do about all this? I mean, what is the call to action with everything that is going on? Since we are speaking about immigration, I think it's again going back to it's necessary to see that the Muslim face is at the center of all the immigration policies that is recently being developed. So more than development of immigration policies, we should be looking at these policies as national security policies. Much was said about last year's Senate bill when they passed. When you cut through all the commas and periods and exclamation marks, you find out that more than the immigration policy, it wasn't a comprehensive immigration reform, but it was further strengthening of the comprehensive enforcement regime, we should call it. So rather than CIR, it's more of an enforcement rather than immigration reform, because you saw time after time and monies after monies and allocations and the strengthening of these structures, whether it was more militarization of the border, whether it was allowing the drones to surveil 100 miles within inside the territory, or it was like, just giving the Customs and Border Patrol extraordinary powers to stop and detain and check people. I think so that by itself needs to be seen, but yet at the same time, when you look at the trajectory of that, particularly after 9/11, particularly after the Patriot Act, what we see is that here's a terrorist, this is someone we have to protect ourselves from, and this is how we will do that. But the question is, and this is actually a big challenge for the Muslim community as well, that what are we obligated to, and what is incumbent upon us? Because when we look at the sheer numbers, and doing a lot of work around national security and doing a lot of work, particularly on the role of local police around surveillance, spying, and infiltration, what is happening is that a lot of these programs are then being used and implemented to target black and brown communities. For example, the National Security Program of Suspicious Activity Reporting, which started as a counterterrorism program, which basically allows local law enforcement and community members and local neighbors to call and snitch on suspicious activity. And what is that suspicious activity? Taking photographs in public, drawing diagrams in public, using binoculars in public, using video cameras in public. It's just typical, everyday, benign, innocent activities. But yet at the same time, when you get the numbers from the Los Angeles Police Department or various police departments, we saw this audit that came out of the Inspector General's office, and in that there was a race data. Now remember that this is something that was originally designed for counterterrorism to protect ourselves from those terrorist Muslims, right? But yet at the same time, when we see that data, 82% of those SARs, the suspicious activity reports, were opened on individuals identified as non-whites. And the largest number in that sample was on African Americans. So again, what we see is that how these policies are developed. I'll give you another example of, there's another local program called predictive policing. And predictive policing is something that developed after a grant that was given to a professor from the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. And the work was to see if through mathematical equations and algorithms, they can track acts of insurgency and terror and then predict that when the next attack, any insurgent attack or terrorism is going to happen in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, the good professor decided there's a lot of money to be made, so we can't put aside the corporate profit making that's always very much driving a lot of these programs. And after the grant, $5 million grant in 2006, he brought these programs here to Los Angeles, and again, LAPD as a willing partner in this thing. The first presentation he made in 2009 to the U.S. military and LAPD was that he went to East LA in Boyle Heights, and he took photographs of Latino youth. And now remember, this predictive issue of predicting terrorist attack is about Iraq and Afghanistan, but now it's been incorporated in local policing. So he used a slideshow. In one slide, he has photos of Afghani men sitting with weapons, and it was labeled as terrorist. And the next slide he had was of these Latino youth who were just at a park, and it's labeled as urban predators and gang members and domestic terrorists. So race and how these programs, so I'm raising these issues that as we talk about the impact on assault on the Muslim community, I think there's also an obligation that the Muslim community has as well in reaching out to several other communities who happen to become the recipients of a lot of this sort of the assault that the state has on people. Talking about immigration, for example, one of the policies that was pushed predominantly that ended up being pushed by the FBI was the SCOM program. And one of the key features of the SCOM program, Secure Communities program, was biometrics gathering. And now FBI has developed this next generation through biometrics and information gathering on people where they have close to about information on 75 million residents in the United States, but now it is seeping into our daily lives as well, where the LA sheriffs announced that they are going to be the first local law enforcement agency in the country where now they have set up a database which can get biometrics for 15 million subjects. So when we talk about these policies, again, I think it's necessary that we keep on incorporating that how does it impact our daily lives, how law enforcement is using it in a very methodical way, and then how do we then organize to dismantle this thing. So in essence, there's been a lot of organizing that has been going on the ground, but I think while there has been a lot of organizing, there are also several issues within the community itself, and this is coming from community advocates and people who are pretty active in the community, that how there are certain elements in our own communities that are co-opting and partnering with law enforcement as well. I mean, the most recent example is this development of the Homegrown Violent Extremism program, Countering Violent Extremism. That program has come from one of the Muslim organizations who's partnering with the LAPD and pushing this program, but yet when you look at the program, it's very much a facade, and it is about behavioral surveillance. So as we counter these things, I think we also need to reflect as a community too that what are the challenges that we face within, that how all the struggles that we have, all the programs that we are fighting, yet at the same time concurrently there's a parallel stream where partnerships are being developed, and I have not seen a single partnership that has benefited the Muslim community at all. Partnerships going back to 2001. When Professor Deborah Ramirez, who used to work for Robert Mueller at the FBI, started this public-private partnership around counterterrorism surveillance. Well, you go to this meeting, and next thing you know, it became a sales job for the Patriot Act. And then next thing you know, slowly we started seeing informants coming into our communities and infiltrating the mosques. So how these doors were opened based in the guise of this partnership. The Muslim mapping program, for example, that was going to get started in Los Angeles as well, where organizations stated that, yeah, this is a good idea because we need to protect ourselves. And when we took that whole idea out to the community, there was a Bangladeshi Day happening. We did a street survey of 300 community members, and out of those, about 298 of them, the first thing they asked us was that if we agree with this program and if we partner with this program, then what we are saying, and we're acknowledging that there are terrorists amongst us. So why do we even take that first step in even acknowledging and partnering with these agencies?
Okay. I would like to open it up to you all to ask questions. We're going to pass around a mic again for the sake of the video, but if you all don't have any questions, I have a few that I'd like to ask, but I wanted to defer to you first. Anyone have a question? No? Okay. I'm going to pull this off so that we can answer for the sake of the video. Okay, so my question is, can one of you, and any of you can pick, talk a little bit about the state of play? So I think that there's been a lot of discussion right now about executive action. I know Mira mentioned that there is a bill that passed in the House recently that we think probably will get vetoed about executive action, and that several states have filed lawsuits against executive action. So besides executive action, what is the state of play? What's happening with immigration reform as it stands now? Can we, Jenny, you're smiling, so maybe you can, okay.
Well, I'm definitely not an expert on the executive action, but I mean, I would say, I think most who are following the news know that I think the president has taken a bold step, as he should, by announcing the executive action, and the question now is, how will Congress respond? And so ideally, hopefully, the Congress will respond in a positive way and actually hear the voice of the people and finally pass some kind of immigration reform. But I think it's really early now to see and to know how that's going to play out. As Mira mentioned, 17 states filed a lawsuit challenging the executive action. I think that that's just sheerly a political move. The lawsuit doesn't appear to have much merit at all. But these are the things that we have to monitor to see, how it all shakes out politically. But time is now for immigration reform, and so hopefully Congress will hear the call and of their constituents, regardless of what side of the aisle they sit on, and finally pass it.
I just want to I think when we look at the state of play, as we speak about whether it's going to open up opportunities for people to adjust their status, that remains to be seen. But one thing that remains constant and continuing is the militarization of the border, the further getting more and more Customs and Border Patrol personnel in there, more and more immunity for those federal agencies and the way they have been violating people's rights, and there have been killings of people on the borders as well. And then obviously that this whole mix of federal and local partnership, that what we saw around 287G and the ESCOM program, but yet in the context of national security, how they're getting further strengthened as well. So the state of play itself needs to be broadened to see that, more than the benefits, like what are some of the challenges and what is the adverse impact on the communities in the long run.
If you want to hold on, my next question. Okay, so you talked a little bit, Hamid, about NCERS and the impact, and I know that Jenny has talked a little bit about this as well. If we could look at, sort of paint a picture of what is that impact, and I think that we haven't really talked about NCERS in quite some time,
right.
And yet the impact of it is still impacting our communities. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Maybe NCERS also need to look at NCERS at that moment in time as well, when mass detentions and deportations were taking place immediately after 9/11. At the time, at least the organization that I was with, we had set up shop outside the federal building for 3 months. Every morning from 7 a.m. till 2 p.m. And then we had a bunch of attorneys on call, and basically intervening constantly into when people were going into to register. The impact was, of course, besides the 13,000 notices to appear and 86,000 people registered. I think the long-term impact was also looking at the tactics as well. One of the things that I did immediately in the aftermath of NCERS, that I ended up going to Pakistan. And through various sort of meetings and all that, meeting with the Pakistani equivalent of Customs and Border Patrol, and try to track down deportees. And I was able to interview about 20 or so deportees in Karachi and in Lahore as well. And some of the stories were quite, just fascinating. One quick story was that this individual was pulled out of a family portrait. And the way that happened was that there was a raid at someone's house in Dallas, and then a woman was there. She had just had a baby. Found out that, as tradition goes, she had come to a parent's house to have the baby. She was there. She woke up. There was the FBI, ATF, and all the other forces that always showed up at that time with the helicopters and cruisers and all that. And then the family woke up. So they had gone there to get her brother. So he gets detained. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. And then they ask her who she was, and she says, "This is who I am. I'm just here to have my." She goes. Then they said, "Where's your husband?" She says, "He's at home." And then they look at the family portrait and they start asking about all those individuals in that portrait, and they point to this one person and said, "Who is that?" And she says, "That is my husband." And that's when they made her call him from his house. He comes over to his in-laws' place, and next thing you know, he's detained and he's deported as well. So what brings me to the story is that one key piece was about assets. That a lot of these individuals, I had my own aunt's son, my first cousin, who was deported as well, and still we don't know what happens to his laptop, what happened to his car, what happened to his stereo, what happened to his personal belongings. So asset forfeiture was a big issue as well, besides, the whole material loss was very huge as well. The material loss for this family was that this person had been driving taxis and been working, as they call those odd jobs and all that for 20 years, finally got some money, got himself a partnership into a gas station, was doing something, and next thing you know, now he loses the gas station. Nobody knows what happened to the gas station or what happened to the assets. So these are some of the things that, as we are looking at these stories, we should be looking at some of the, some of the deeper material loss as well, and how do people even recuperate that? These are life savings for people.
I'll just add on NSEERS, I think, the program technically still exists, although it's not active so far as we know. But the programs that we do know that are active, I think, are directly flow from NSEERS. So the program that I alluded to in my comments is the CARP program, which is the immigration's program to screen for national security concerns. Well, what's more, sort of what I find actually more insidious about this program than NSEERS in a way is that it essentially is doing the same thing of creating lists, creating categories of people that they are flagging as concerns based on what country they come from, which is exactly what NSEERS was. If you came from, I think, a list of 25 countries, you had to register, right? With this new program, you don't have to do anything, and you're never told that something is being done to you. But this program exists and will flag you if you're from one of these 25 countries, as well as the various other things that I mentioned. If you're on the watch list, if you are associated with somebody they consider suspicious. So I think there's kind of even more insidious ways that these same types of policies are reoccurring. And when I say they're more insidious, it's because we don't actually know that they're happening to people, and so it's much more harder to defend against. Yeah.
Sorry, to go back to your earlier question about the administrative relief, I think that one thing that I did want to kind of add to it was the UN recently assessed the policy, and they felt that it was against the Convention of Torture, because part of the process is, or part of what, with the militarization of the border is trying to keep out the refugees that are coming in from south of the border. And I think that while a lot of immigration policies have been shaped in response to 9/11 and terrorism, the impact of those policies goes well beyond Muslim populations. And so the way that the refugees are being screened, and also the quick deportation of them doesn't allow them to fully present their case and to seek asylum in a fair way. And so I think it's interesting when, on the one hand, people are very excited about administrative relief, especially the Latino population, because the ones that are already here a lot of them will be getting a form of relief. But then people who are trying to escape violence from their home countries and to come here as refugees they're not being treated as refugees, or being allowed to come in and to go through the process as it was intended to, as it was originally intended to be.
Okay, great. Actually, on that note, not about refugees, but you talked about border security, and one of the questions that I'm getting off social media is actually about that. So there's a lot of us in DC have been working with the DOJ to hopefully redo their guidance on profiling. And there's a lot of news, and I know that a lot of us will probably be speculating and talking about it because we don't really know what's happened, but there's a lot of buzz this weekend about the fact that it may be modified to not profile on the basis of national security and religion. We hope that that's the case, although I don't think that that's going to be true. But there is reporting that says that the border, regardless of what comes out, will not have that exception. So can you all, whoever wants to talk about that first, can talk a little bit about it, and then we can go from there. Hamid's saying yes. So yeah.
I can just. Yeah, I saw those exemptions that were reported as well. That one on the border, and even ports, airports, seaports, and all, they will have that exemption as well. But I think the other key piece, and particularly in light of what's been going on with the murders of young black men, is that local law enforcement it wouldn't apply to them unless they are working with the federal government. So if there is a partnership or where federal grants are included, that's the only time that some of those profiling or anti-profiling laws would apply. But local law enforcement would continue to have that immunity and exemption from those laws as well. So while I think it can maybe seen as a step in the right direction per se, the flip side to that is then that becomes a marker. And then, so unless we really fight for it, and then that becomes a marker, and the marker becomes an extremely watered down marker that creates more vulnerabilities and challenges in the long run than benefits that people will have. So,
yeah, I don't know that I have much more to add. I think to me it's a troubling sign of the continued importance of immigration law to the federal government in their eyes for national security, that the fact that they are excluding borders from their policy on racial profiling signals, I think, the importance that they continue to see in profiling as a tool for national security and as a tool in the immigration system. And so I think those connections that I talked about are just going to continue to be strong and possibly become even stronger as we go forward. Yeah.
Great. We still no question. Oh, we do have a question. Great. If you could introduce yourself too. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vivek Mittal. I'm an immigration attorney here in the community, and I have a question about the connection between LAPD spying and the kind of the stuff that Hamid really focuses on. And then the getting onto those watch lists that Jenny was talking about. So is there a connection between the two? And then the second part is, if I have a client whose case is being held up at USCIS because they might be on a watch list, what's the way in which I can advocate and do administrative advocacy to work with that? Or do I need to just call you and then you guys file a lawsuit?
Call Jenny. Turn around, I'll get you off the list.
I wish I had that power. You want to start?
Go ahead.
Well, I'm sure Hamid has more to say about the local spying, but I think that my assumption is that even if you're not subject to any kind of federal spying, if you're subject to LAPD spying, that information is likely being shared with the federal government just because of the degree of information sharing that we know exists between law enforcement, whether it's among federal agencies or between local agencies and federal agencies. And we see this across all types of work, not just on the national security side, but also on immigration enforcement, which is something that I know very well as well. And so I would assume that any information collected by LAPD is likely to end up at the FBI. And the FBI is really the key player when it comes to the watch list because the FBI is the nominator. So they're the ones that will nominate people to the watch list. And again, there's not any real evidentiary standard that requires more than just their own hunch that somebody could be suspicious, and how they define a hunch is obviously problematic because it relies on profiling. So then you get onto the watch list, and then of course your client is in your office and seeking a green card or naturalization, and sure enough, their application is delayed years and years and years. And when they go in for their immigration interview, they're questioned for hours about their relationship to the mosque, their relationship to people in their community. Where you see that the immigration process itself is being turned into a forum for phishing and for law enforcement purposes. So what would I say to you about how to deal with those cases? Obviously, of course, you can always call me. But moreover, I think it's important just to know that the policies exist and to be on the alert for cases that likely fall into this category, where so again, people from certain countries are likely to be flagged, and then if they're active in the community, particularly in the Muslim community, if they're active in their mosque, if they're active in any political organizations, people that may have even family members who are on the watch list, even if they're not on the watch list themselves, they're likely going to be candidates for being profiled under the CART program. And then to just be extra cautious in how you prepare that client for any immigration interview and how you prepare your applications, because you need to know that those applications are going to be heavily scrutinized and they're going to be looking for any possible way to deny the application. So, and then, of course, with the delays, there's ways to file lawsuits if you want. But the challenge is that this policy says that as long as you're subject to it, the agency has to deny. They cannot approve your application. And so sometimes by forcing them to make a decision, it just forces them to deny the decision. And so there it becomes like really a question of strategy and the individual case and different factors. But you can always call me. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think Jenny kind of, sorry, Jenny, I'm just going to keep on doing this. What I can add to Jenny's point is that information gathering, information storing, and information sharing has now become the whole modus operandi of both federal and local policing. And I think one thing we need to also look at is that traditionally the investigative type policing of after the fact has now shifted. There's this, over time, this new concept has developed, which is called intelligence-led policing, in which information is gathered, information is stored, and information is shared. So even while we are concerned about the watch list, what is happening is that through fusion centers and many other data storage facilities, information is shared with all the agencies. There was a report that came out by the General Accountability Office, GAO, last year in March of 2013. And just looking at one program, the Suspicious Activity Reporting Program, which basically is, and which is interesting also, that how suspicious is defined, and it's defined, and I quote directly, is that it's observed behavior reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning of criminal and or terrorist activity. So when you break it down, that observed behavior, somebody's behavior is being observed, which is reasonably indicative. There's no criminal predicate. There's no probable cause, no reason. Reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning. So you're observing somebody's behavior, which indicates to you that this person may be thinking of doing something in the future. Right? So speculative policing and hunch-based policing is now being legitimized, which leads to opening of a secret file called the Suspicious Activity Report, which now the LAPD wants to hold it for 10 years, right? LAPD insists that unless it meets a reasonable suspicion standard, they don't send it to the fusion center. But when you look at the fusion centers, their own records show that less than 2% even meet that standard. So thousands and thousands of these reports are going to the Fusion Center, and through the Fusion Center, through the information sharing environment, as per the GAO report now, that this SAR program is now in 46 states, and this is March of 2013, so about a year and a half ago. In 46 states, 14,200 law enforcement agencies have already incorporated in this thing. Close to 300,000 law enforcement individuals have been trained. Every federal agency, not just the FBI, every federal agency, including HUD, SSA, Wildlife and Fisheries. So every agency has this program now. So it's not just about the FBI having a watch list. The big issue is of false positives, because private contractors also have access to this information through the fusion centers as well. So pre-employment check, so where you could be somebody else. So I think these are the things structurally we should be looking at, that while, of course, the watch list is critical, but we may not even know that why. And of course, I'm reminded of the study that Cornell had done back in 2004, around that time, that out of the 750 Muslim named resumes, 2 people got a call. And of course, it was right after 9/11. But increasingly, when you have these individuals in these lists and you're doing pre-employment checks, when you're traveling, when you're out there with your family, you could be out at a park or something, constantly your information is being shared, whether you're a Muslim or a non-Muslim or what. So there's a lot of information sharing that can have a very negative impact on that.
I mean, I think what's interesting about when you look at all of these different surveillance mechanisms, it's really turning due process, the whole premise of due process, on its head, because it's like this idea that you're guilty until proven innocent. And I think one thing that struck me when I began doing this work is that it used to be with the FBI, for example, that if the FBI was conducting an investigation, they would open a file on you. That file would remain open while they're conducting the investigation, and then at some point the file gets closed. But with all of this information sharing, with all of this information gathering that's just gathering of information without any specific investigation, a file gets opened on you and it stays open. It's never closed. And so as long as it's open, as they're sharing this information, all of these agencies are then deeming you to be a national security concern, even though no charges have ever been filed against you, you have no way to respond to this concern. And then, of course, it starts to have all these really bad impacts on your life, like in the immigration system or, traveling or bank accounts or whatever it is.
And even if there's no nexus to terrorism or criminal activities found in fusion centers, the FBI gets to keep your file for 30 years. So you're forever in the system.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to add, with the suspicious activity reporting program, for example, I think that the secret nature of these programs is also, as Jenny had mentioned, the insidiousness of it, of a CARP, for example, where you never really know why your application is being denied for so long. And the suspicious activity program kind of exemplifies it, because in their order, although your information is shared nationally through the Fusion Center, it's shared with all kinds of federal, local, and state agencies, you yourself cannot really find out about the suspicious activity report. And what I mean by that is, the only way that you can get access to your suspicious activity report is if you have a court order that states that they need to release your suspicious activity report to you. But until, so it's kind of circular. It's like you can't get this file until you know that there's a file, but you can't know because, you need to file a lawsuit. And, when you go into court as a lawyer, you need to have standing before you even start something. So it's like, how can you say you have standing when you're not really sure, what do you go in and say? I took a picture on the freeway once, and I'm not sure if my Facebook photo is now put me on in a file. And so it's, you can't just submit a FOIA request or something and ask them to release that information to you. So I think it's very circular, and it's very difficult to get that information. And so so those are sources of concern, obviously.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, Mary.
I have a question, but I think all of you kind of touched on it. It's regarding this hunch, this idea of just this arbitrary sort of selection of individuals who are subject to deportation. And I was just wondering, it sounds like it's just completely random and you just have a hunch and you can go and deport someone. Is there any criteria beyond that? Are people doing something to put themselves in a position to just be in that position? Can you talk about that a little bit? Is there more of a criteria that that allows people to be on such lists?
Who wants to take it first?
Okay. No, I would say this hunch can be defined in so many ways, and I would hesitate to give any kind of particular criteria for what could end up leading you to be on the watch list or subject to surveillance or subject to immigration denials. The pattern that I see in my work is people that are from certain countries. Usually it's men, but sometimes it's women also. That alone can be enough to apparently signal some kind of concern and to land you on the list. I have so many cases where it's just, I know every detail of people's lives as much as I can as their attorney, and I can't figure out any reason why the government may have put them on the watch list, for example. Beyond race or religion, no. And like I said, it can be that your name is in an FBI file because you attended a mosque where an informant was providing names of people who are attending the mosque. But I have plenty of clients who never go to mosque. I have a number who are from Iran, and although they were born in a Muslim country, they're not Muslim, yet they still seem to be profiled in this way. So I do think that in a lot of ways, it's as broad as what country you come from. And sometimes it's, other characteristics, like if you speak many languages. I had a client years ago now who was put on the no-fly list. And again, it was incomprehensible why she was on the no-fly list. She was practicing Muslim. She was married to an imam. And at one point, an FBI agent said to her, "You speak many languages." And it was as if that was the reason why they were concerned about her, is because she was extremely intelligent and spoke a number of languages. So there are these other criteria that seem to be applied in the sort of profiling that's done. I have a number of clients right now who are engineers. I don't know if that's something that is a flag for them. I've had clients who specialize in airplane technicians, or who had flight licenses. I had one client a few years ago who was a very accomplished math professor at Cornell University, who also knew a lot about computers. So there's all these other professional categories that seem to also play into the way that profiling is done, but it's hard to point your finger to any particular things. And then sometimes, I think with the watch listing criteria, one thing that's clear is that just by being associated with somebody who's on the watch list can put you on the watch list. So if you work with someone who's on the watch list, that alone can be enough for the FBI to put you on the watch list, or if a family member is on the watch list. And this is particularly true for non-citizens. There's a whole separate category of criteria for when a non-citizen can be placed on the list, and it's much more flimsy and sort of broad and standard list than it is for citizens. So does that answer your question?
All I'd say is driving while black.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen this, the history constantly speak to it, and now, of course, flying while Muslim or being out there while South Asian. So all I would add is that, at least as a non-attorney, I have a tendency to look at it more through a cultural and political and economic histories of a place as well. And I think while there is a general sense to at least hope or expect about that, about constitutional protections, yet, historically speaking, communities have never had that kind of protection at all. So I think in that, again, the creation of the other to remain permanently targeted. And when this first thing came up, we would speak about the experience of the South Asian or the Muslims as the fifth face in that history. Starting with the savage native, so how land grab had taken place and how culturally that face was paraded, and it becomes a part of the cultural imagination, the economic structures that get built, the law enforcement that gets operationalized, the face of the criminal black. You look at the Jim Crow laws, you look at the Sunset laws, you look at all these laws that get developed, the face of the perpetually illegal Latino, that how that plays out in our society as well. Then the disloyal, manipulative Asian face, and now the terrorist face. So I think it would be that while we look at how they can do that, they can because they will. And they do because they can. And that's what we see day in and day out. So I think more than sometimes that leads to a call to action, that while we tend to place a lot of our sort of energies into advocacy, but what we have seen is unless communities organize and build that base and build a grassroots movement, advocacy doesn't lead to anything. I'm reminded of this thing that we were just talking about, profiling. There's been this constant effort about IRPA, and Racial Profiling Act. Well, people have been working on it, and what do we have now? That at the end of the day, just how many people even interact with federal agencies on a daily basis? It's the local law enforcement. It's a local agency that we constantly confronted with. But now what Eric Holder is coming out with is an extremely watered-down version, just checking a box basically in response to what happened. It doesn't even address what happened in Ferguson. It doesn't even address what happened in New York or Staten Island. So I think that's what it really comes down to, that unless we really build that base, and unless it's more intersectional in nature, advocacy, unfortunately, doesn't lead us to very many places.
Do you have anything else to add? You're okay? Are there any other questions? Yes, Robert.
Hello, everybody. So my question goes back to the executive action that just took place recently. So we've heard a lot of attention about, immigration rights groups hailing this as a victory, and obviously there's been a lot of attention on the Republicans' reaction to the law that's passed. So my question is, is there, what should be the community's response to this executive action? Is there any concerns that come to mind that the community should take into account? Concerns that come to my mind that I can think of is, for one, this is only a temporary relief, so it's making people come out of the shadows and get registered into a database. And from past programs like the Bracero program, once it's over, then those people are made to go home. And then another one with the militarization of the border, that causes more problems because there's been numerous instances where U.S. government officials have shot into Mexico and shot Mexicans in Mexico because they were near the border, and they've killed Mexicans on the border. And they've also started taking more land from the indigenous tribes that actually line the border, like the To'odam, the Yaqui, and the Apache, which have actually had some of their tribal members deported and killed as a result of the militarization. So yeah, that's just your thoughts on that issue.
Well, I think, I personally do have some of those concerns also about the sunset of the program and what's going to happen to people once they register. As an organization, our stance has been that the more people that register and, bulk up the program, the more difficult it is for future governments to come and repeal the program. But, I'm not necessarily sure that that's always going to be true when even as we speak, like there's so much opposition to the relief that's being granted, and people already want to get rid of it. So the fact that 2 years later or 4 years later, if it's but there's like a reissuance of relief, there's no guarantee that it's not going to be repealed. We can only like hope and advocate on behalf of those people to try and make sure that doesn't happen. I think that the hope is that if there's a lot of people that have gotten that relief, it just becomes really politically unpopular for people to then come in and change the program as it is. And I mean, the militarization of the border is a big issue, and I think linking it with Muslim issues, I think that in the media and the from the right, we do hear people trying to link those issues together, where like refugees are coming in and there was a huge child migrant crisis that's ongoing, but I would hear statements like, oh, these Muslim terrorists are coming in disguising themselves as El Salvadorian children, and like, oh, we found like a prayer mat and a Quran in the backpack of one of these kids. And it's just like rhetoric like that, which is trying to like conflate the hatred that people have for different groups and into like one big, like, everyone that's not from here is your enemy, and close our borders down to anyone that's brown. This is essentially what I'm getting from it. So it is problematic, and I think that even when there was a hope last year of immigration reform passing, part of the large part of that bill was, border militarization. And so even though as people that live here, we're concerned about the rights of people that are already in the country and trying to get them legal status, we should be mindful that there are other people in the world that may need to come here, as refugees or as asylees and get assistance, but won't be allowed to. And even just, apart from as refugees, just people that want to come here and reunite with their families, it's going to become harder and harder for people outside of the country to come in.
I mean, I think it's, and this is a very key question that you raise, because quite honestly, and of course, knowing many people who are undocumented, it's just like, people are looking for the last straw just for survival. But I think, ironically, it is more or less, it is more of making a mockery of people's desperation as well. And this is something, so in order for us to examine it further, I think the responsibility really lies with the immigrant rights movement and people who claim that space and people who take the charge and make those representations. And I think that while we are looking at it now, but we need to go back and look at the 1986 reform that happened, which was the first time that employer sanctions were imposed. So enforcement started around right there. And at that time, there was quite a bit of movement to take a strong position against it and fight against it. But then, the issue of the labor unions, that what their role was at the time, how the employer sanctions became a part of this whole package of IRCA. And then enforcement became the more defining feature of immigration law. I mean, originally as designed to be an adjudicating body, it became an enforcement body. And then when you look at the budget stuff as well, that that ICE has about 80% of the budget of the whole immigration system, so enforcement. So I think it's really goes down to that who's making those representations and what sort of organizing has been going on, because I think it does create a sort of I think it's a TPS, right? It's being a temporary protected status, the way this executive order is working.
It's not, no,
it's not a TPS. It's a
deferred action.
deferred action. Yeah, that's right. It's a deferred action. But so I think it really makes people much more vulnerable. So now the question becomes like, what happens? What is a permanent solution to this thing? Now that has been sidelined, put aside, and just how does it then creates more and more detriment for people who? And quickly, I'm reminded that I did that migrant trail a couple times, going from Cesa Bay, Mexico, and walking through Sonora Desert. It's about 76-mile journey from Sonora to Tucson, and we did that. And there's a group in Tucson called Derechos Humanos that does that every year to honor the people who die. I mean, close to about 300 people die in the desert. And we had the privilege of water and food and tents and all that stuff, like for 7 days. But when you walk through that area, that region, about 76 miles, I mean, you come across people leaving their belongings. You come across how people can completely lose their mind, and you hear all these stories that how there was this one point that we saw that these migrants were lost, and as they were crossing the desert, they came to the tent, to our camp, and they said there were two other women that they had left behind, and they were hungry, they were starving, they hadn't had water. So we gave them water and food, and then a small party went with them to look for the women, but we couldn't find those women. Which then reminded me of another thing that as we were leaving from Cesa Bay, Mexico, the pastor of the local church told us, and this goes to the viciousness of this system as well, that how vicious and brutal and violent and gross and vulgar the system is, that that women at that time had started taking birth control pills 2 weeks prior to when they would be crossing the desert. And I'm sitting there thinking, and the reason why they were taking birth control pills is because of the high rate of sexual assault. And I'm sitting there thinking that, okay, this is a community, somebody's leaving on a journey, and typically people ask that person who's leaving that, do you have your passport, or do you have your this, or you're going on a journey? And here you're reminding a young woman that, have you taken your birth control pill, because you will be raped. So I think that if that really goes to show that how deeply vulgar this whole system is, and in essence what is happening is that while we are talking about migration, what we need to be talking about also is the right to stay. That it's not just about the right to mobility, that how people's right to stay because of circumstances of economic violence and displacement and war, that how people are. I mean, the U.S. gets maybe less than 6% of the people that migrate around the world. There's close to about, this is UN reports, close to 200 million people migrate every year around the world, and U.S. gets a small portion of that. So I think the right to stay, because of our foreign policies, because of our economic policies, completely uproot people. So I think that's where the conversation and the organizing need to happen. Otherwise, these are very band-aid, superficial type remedies that they're using.
Just to add one particular concern coming out of the announcements on November 20th is that I think is relevant to this conversation we've been having today is the government announced that aside from the relief that they're providing, that they are making some changes on the enforcement side. And one is that they were ending the so-called Secure Communities program, but replacing it with a program called Priority Enforcement Program, which is essentially the same thing in just a different clothing. And what's significant about it is that although the Secure Communities program was really the government's signature deportation program, and the way that they were identifying people was through local law enforcement, through local jails, that they're still going to be doing that same thing. They're just not going to be asking the local jails to detain someone for immigration purposes, but they're still collecting their biometrics. They're still going to be looking at every person who comes through the jail to see if there's any possible immigration issue, and then possibly seeking to pick them up from the jail as they're being released. So I think for me, a big concern is to be mindful that this is continuing, and to really be watching how the government implements this program, because I think that we're likely to see many of the same problems that we've been seeing in the past, where ICE, for the agency that does enforcement, will say our priorities are to only deport serious criminals from our communities, when in fact everyone is getting deported, including, victims of crimes. And so one thing that I think we need to be really mindful of is the way in which our local law enforcement agencies are still cooperating and allowing our jails to be used as sites for identifying people for deportation, and really hold the government to their commitment to only identify people who meet certain criteria. Because I think very likely we're going to see that everyone is continuing to be identified because their information is being shared in the same way as before for deportation purposes.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I have a question. Mira, you talked a lot about DV survivors and some of the issues that DV survivors face, especially with regards to immigration. And there was recently a case, and I know that this is not a novel issue, it has been in several instances, but there was a case in Guatemala of a Guatemalan woman who was given asylee status because they said that being a DV survivor was a social group. Are you seeing that that's actually being applied for more DV survivors to get asylee status to be able to come to the U.S., or what is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have necessarily statistics, but I do think that it is something that immigration advocates are trying to use as one of the ways to assist people in getting asylum. It was actually because of the government's own brief that they submitted to the immigration court, where they recognized that domestic violence could be the inability to leave an abusive relationship, actually. Like, people who are in an abusive relationship and are unable to leave it because of the society that exists in their home country may be eligible for asylum. And, in particular, when people are coming in from Central American countries where gang-based asylum is still, it's very hard to get asylum when you're trying to escape a gang. And so domestic violence is like an alternative form of relief that people request, because unfortunately, as I mentioned before, domestic violence is prevalent in so many communities across the world. But it's also, something that Muslim advocates use as a form of relief. And yeah.
Okay, well, it's almost exactly 5 o'clock, so I want to thank you all for being here. And I really enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we'll keep in touch and continue to work on these issues in the future. Thank you.